I'm Kamal, Solaylee, and I'll be talking about the art of learning. More than any other time in Ontario's history, and particularly in Toronto, universities are being asked to become less places of learning and more job factories, a clearinghouse for commercial needs. Even the once education minister has joined the voices that want to teach universities a lesson in responsibility. In Canada as a whole, the war against science and evidence is best exemplified by the muzzling of environmental groups and the cutback of funding for research centers. Knowledge and learning about ourselves have become targets, disposable items on budget bills. To illustrate that, look at what happened or what's happening to the cutback in Statistics Canada. A recent Globe and Mail column pointed out that the recent financial crisis has pitted healthcare against education. Canadians are more preoccupied with healthcare. It wins, but we all lose. We lose post-secondary institutions that here in the city literally frame the city. When you think about it, you have York universities up north, you have Humber down south, and you have Bryson and U of T St. George campus in the center, and you have the Mississauga and the Scarborough campuses on east and west. But I'm not going to talk about the professor class in which I belong, but let me tell you something about my students. I feel better about this city whenever I walk through the Ryerson campus where I work. What I see is the whole world. I see the second generation of immigrants who would have arrived here perhaps 20, 30 years ago and struggled to give their children a better education and start in life than what they have experienced in their different home countries. Education becomes not just a goal in and of itself, but the start of a new narrative in the story of Canada. I hear my students often say, we're here to stay and to make this country home. The first step usually is a strong and Canadian post-secondary education. For me to stand here and tell you that their job is to become carpenters while I sit in my study and read a book is disgraceful. If the education retrenching continues, what we lose here is not just a few jobs or a few untenured professors being turfed out. We lose the very foundations that make living in Toronto so unique. Our universities and schools should remain open to all, welcoming of all, and affordable to all. It is something that Toronto has taught me. I immigrated to Canada in April of 1996 with a PhD in Victorian melodrama. Not very employable, but I believe that my real education began on the streets of Toronto. What I've learned from Toronto went beyond what I picked up in books or classrooms, and is certainly not something that my previous lives, I was 31 when I arrived here, my previous life in the Middle East or the United Kingdom could have prepared me for. I don't think anything, to be honest, could have prepared me for my first ride on the TTC on my first day in Toronto. After almost 8 years in the British Midlands, in Nottinghamshire and Staffordshire, where I was often the only non-white person on the bus to and from campus, kind of like the Sydney Poitiers of the English Midlands, I arrived in a city that, at least on the surface, seemed to belong to everyone. And I think that word has come up several times, I think a sense of belonging, regardless of race, language, skin color, or background. I learned what's it like to share, to live, and to coexist peacefully. So what, I hear you say? Did I not mention I grew up in the Middle East, where those ideals that we take so much for granted in Toronto are in short supply? Ever since that first ride, Toronto continued to teach me something new about living in a city every day. I've learned how important it is to have a place like Toronto so that immigrants and refugees from Eastern Europe, Somalia, the Middle East, or even the United States of America can start new lives in dignity and in peace. But most importantly, I learned the difference between a neighborhood and a ghetto, something that has dogged me all my life. My first shared apartment in Toronto was in Market Street in Little Italy. And my first small one-bedroom was an alleyway off Chinatown, not very far from here, a few blocks actually from here. In each place, I may have been outnumbered by the communities that lend it its name, but I've never felt excluded. I've never felt unwelcome. I quickly learned that the city draws in new blood where it can. Territoriality of any kind is discouraged. I currently live in St. Clair on Avenue Road. Admittedly, it's multiculturalism lost battle, but it's the demographic skew is older. But I've also heard stories from English war brides, from German Holocaust survivors, from children of Irish immigrants, and the staff in my building who seem to come exclusively from Latin America, which is the latest wave of immigration to this welcoming city. And many more will come, and it will add their stories to the big book of Canada. I like to think when that happens, our schools and post-secondary institutions will be there to give them the most important lesson of all, learning how to respect and live with others in the city. I'm going to end by saying I'm sorry if I sound like the spoken book version of a grant application to the Ontario Arts Council. At the very least, I've learned the art of grant writing, a skill that no academic or artist in the city can live without. Thank you.